The National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Mike Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thanks, Mike. From Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, we've sent American troops to the far corners of the world. The question is, what in the world for? On today's program, we'll talk about how our trigger-happy ways have harmed our country.
Our program, as usual, will consist of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and an in-depth analysis of the entire subject by our panel of experts. We'll begin our probe report, Policemen of the World, following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty, because we agree with Thomas Jefferson, that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
The history of American military action has passed through several distinct phases. The Revolutionary and 1812 wars were fought on American soil to create a nation. The Civil War was the tragic consequence of an internal dispute which proved unsolvable by political means. The Mexican and Spanish-American wars, along with the various Indian conflicts, were, rightly or wrongly, old-style wars involving territorial acquisition. And the great conflagrations called World Wars I and II were European upheavals into which the United States was drawn late and reluctantly. Both war presidents, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, had won election on a no foreign war platform. Since World War II, a new and unsettling American military tradition has begun. We have not had a single declaration of war, yet American soldiers by the thousands have perished in the far corners of the globe. The United States has become the policeman of the world.
As long as the Cold War was the defining event for America and communism or Soviet power was the source of the threat, most of the opposition to U.S. military involvement overseas came from the political left. And many of these people had ulterior motives, at least a general sympathy with radical left-wing causes.
Sometimes the left was able to expand support for its efforts, as in Vietnam, where a demographic quirk gave them a large, willing group of disciples. The quirk was the existence of the huge baby boom generation. In the 1960s, it was this age group that was asked to suffer and die in battle. U.S. leadership in the Johnson and Nixon administrations was unable to convince these young people that the American cause in Southeast Asia was worth that price, and so youth became easy prey to left-wing, anti-war agitators. And because of their sheer numbers, they had uncommon political clout.
The early protests against the Vietnam War was only the hard left. The out-and-out communists and their allies, the Trotskyites and so on, with each year, the demonstrations added people who were not of the hard left. It was sort of like expanding concentric circles. And these were people who simply saw no light at the end of the tunnel. They felt that the government had no clear-cut goals, that it was negotiating, bombing, negotiating. It didn't seem to know what it was doing.
Vietnam is history, and as of 1989, so is the communist threat. But now the U.S. role as world policeman is being extended to other kinds of conflicts, and this has raised new concerns about our foreign policy.
I think what we see here is the influence of vested interests. These people either have to fold their tents and go home and reconcile themselves to the fact that the military budget might be going down to $200 billion a year, $150 billion a year, or even less. Or they have to find alternate missions, alternative justifications for maintaining that high level of military spending and that size of a military force.
American lives have been spent for such ostensible purposes as protecting Israel from its neighbors, fighting drug wars, and preserving the flow of Middle Eastern oil to the industrial world. Where will it stop? Will we ultimately find ourselves involved in a major war over such matters? And why is it always us?
The United States regarded military force as the currency of influence in the world. The Germans and Japanese, I think, have very effectively demonstrated that prosperous economies, the ability of their companies to produce first-class products at competitive prices, that can be a source of influence as well.
And speaking of economic power, what about oil in the Middle East?
Oil in the Middle East is there. It seems that Saddam Hussein wants oil in order to pay his debts. He himself demanded a price of $25 a barrel when in his negotiations with OPEC. And OPEC offered him a price of 21 and he agreed. This is shortly before the invasion. So whatever you can say about Saddam Hussein, it is not his fault that the price of oil has gone up, because the more we put pressure on Iraq, the more the price of oil goes up. Iraq wants to sell us, we don't want to buy it, and therefore the price of oil goes up. So it seems to me that if our policy is solely to ensure a market distribution of oil, we followed the wrong policy.
Another troubling aspect of our role has been the constant stream of flip-flops. Saddam Hussein was our friend in the Iran-Iraq war days of the 1980s. Then in 1990, he became another Hitler. Syria's Hafez Assad's image was the reverse. Reviled as a terrorist through the 80s, he supposedly became our friend when Hussein became the enemy. Manuel Noriega was a CIA payroller doing our dirty work. Then suddenly, he was a monster, and we invaded Panama to capture him.
I'm reminded of the old saying that he who lies down with pigs becomes like a pig. And I think that is something that American policymakers ought to keep in mind. Picking sides in conflicts in regions like the Middle East is always a distasteful business. Unlike President Bush's statement that this conflict is a fight between good and evil, between right and wrong, the conflicts in the Middle East and in most other areas of the Third World are rarely that clear-cut. It's usually a conflict between different shades of gray, and quite often rather dirty shades of gray at that.
It's incredible to me, and the Congress hasn't been even debating this thing. And the President hasn't been talking about a declaration of war. The Constitution is very clear about that. The President doesn't. He has the right to conduct foreign policy, but when it comes to war, he should get a declaration of the Congress. It doesn't occur to him. It's a flagrant disregard of the oath he took when he was inaugurated to uphold the Constitution, I think.
The Constitution did not give presidents jurisdiction over foreign policy because the founders believed they would be most likely to involve the nation in war. James Madison put it this way: the history of all governments demonstrates that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. That, he said, was why the Constitution had given the power to declare war to the Congress. But many presidents have worried about the problem too. George Washington warned the young America against foreign entanglements. Dwight Eisenhower warned the mature America against the military-industrial complex. They were military men who knew both the horrors of war and the limitations of military policy. Their words demand our attention today as never before.
Remember when life was simpler and problems were solvable? When you could rely on good common sense and your own honesty and initiative to see you through? That was back before government regulation got so tangled up in our public and private lives, before paperwork and arbitrary rules took over and individual choice was locked out. The National Endowment for Liberty believes that most of our problems cannot be solved by government, that too much government is in itself a problem, not a solution. These programs are made possible as a public service by people who believe that moral and political rights go hand in hand with economic freedom. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. Or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Liberty can set you free.
It seems that the focus keeps changing from why we were there originally, what we're doing now, what we're going to be there months from now, how the situation goes.
Each week on At Issue, we show the probe report you've just seen to a group of citizens somewhere in the United States. What you're watching are the unrehearsed reactions of people in Richmond, Virginia, to the probe report, Policemen of the World.
I'm assuming that we're protecting Saudi Arabia's borders because of their oil fields and their processing areas, more so than Saudi Arabia is our biggest ally in the world, because they're not. And it's just that as of late, it seems to be we're there because we got stuck.
My more passionate side is thank God we're here. Thank God someone's looking out for us, and so forth. And yet, I'm really questioning whether or not we should be. I'm thinking this is a Middle Eastern problem, isn't it? You know what? I hear the resentment of a lot of the Arabs, and when they get out, why are y'all here? And I'm thinking, yeah, why are we there?
The USA is trying to push other countries around. That's the way I see it. That's one reason. I think another reason that we're over there is frankly to distract us from some of the big problems that we have at home.
And I don't understand why we are taking such a big role in what appears, what even the Arabs say is an Arab problem. I don't understand.
I get very concerned about Miss Thatcher saying that she will, defend our last man, and we've got 350,000 and she's got 6,000. I'm getting a little excited about that.
When I was growing up, we had a foreign policy. We believed in the Monroe Doctrine and we believed in the League of Nations. And later, after World War II, we switched over to a containment of communism. That was their foreign policy. And this is why we went into all these little places there. But communism is not a problem today.
I grew up, my father was in the military. He went through World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And my attitude about Vietnam and all that's going on after it was sort of formed by his attitude. But I always remember of him speaking of at least World War II very supportively. But when he came back from Vietnam, it was a totally different attitude about it.
The one personal experience that I did have when I was there at the age of 18, a buck sergeant in 1967, I asked this Vietnamese boy, "Baby son, why you no fight like other baby son, huh?" And he said to me, and I quote, "Man, what are you talking about?" He said, "I go to the University of Maryland. Why should I end up fighting over here when I have fools like yourself to come over here to fight for me?" So as a result of my experience, I don't go along with the United States involvement so actively, being so much of an active participant, deeply involved in what is going on in the Middle East.
Seems like a lot of people have some real reservations about what's been going on. Well, let's see how our panel of experts analyze things. Dr. Sheldon Richman is a scholar with the Institute for Humane Studies. Joe Sobran is the Washington editor of the National Review. And our host and permanent panelist is the chairman of the National Endowment for Liberty, Ron Paul. Ron, why do we keep getting into these foreign predicaments?
Well, I think there's a basic flaw in our policy. We've gone astray. We do not follow the Constitution. We do not follow our American traditions. And especially in this century, our policy has changed. We have become an interventionist government. I believe we became interventionists in many areas. Not only does our government intervene in our personal lives, our government intervenes in the economy, and it intervenes in the internal affairs of other nations. No longer do we take the advice of our founders and what was traditionally the American non-interventionist foreign policy. And I think it's going to continue. This is not a tactical fight. This is not a discussion of when you should go in. The left and the right so often argue about, well, we should go in, he's the enemy, we'll attack him, but we'll let this person alone. And then they switch and they flip-flop, and we lead to a disaster. We don't know why we go into these areas, and it leads to disasters like Korea and Vietnam. Not too long ago, I saw one of our members of Congress on the Judiciary Committee, who's considered a constitutional scholar who would argue for the strict interpretation of the Constitution, argued that the president has the authority to take over Baghdad, march to Baghdad and take it over. And the news commentator asked him, he said, what about the Constitution? The Constitution says that only Congress can declare war. And he came back and he said, well, it doesn't say there's no prohibition for the president to wage war. That was his rationalization. I think that's a basic flaw in our system. And I think that we, as American citizens, will have to come to grips with this. And I have to go to my panel tonight and ask, and just what do you think, and what should we do, and how can this come about? Do you agree that we should be policing the world, or where did we go wrong on this? Joe, what is your opinion of this?
Well, there are no commonly accepted rules or laws under which anyone could police the whole world. What tips me off about the shaky nature of this proposed war is the shifting rationales we get for it. First we hear that our vital interests are at stake, oil, and then we hear, no, it's not oil, it's Saddam Hussein's military capacity. We have to stop him now. Well, that's preposterous, too. In fact, that's sillier than the oil argument. We keep hearing our vital interests are at stake. What vital interests? Why our vital interests and not Bolivia's vital interests? Or what, why is our fate always allegedly at stake everywhere when we're a big and very self-sufficient country?
Well, I think this is a...
someone once said that the point is not to examine a folly, but to see what it accomplishes. Tom Paine said long ago that taxes were not raised to carry on wars, but rather wars were raised to carry on taxes. You have to look at the interests that are served by a big military. We have a problem, as was said earlier in the program. The Defense Department was on its way to having its budget cut just before Saddam Hussein went into Iraq. This saved a lot of people's jobs and budgets, and we can't discount that. The reason they want to rush in with all this force is because they have to save an otherwise crumbling military establishment that should be crumbling along with the Soviet Union. And they've stopped it.
I slightly disagree. I don't think this was a Pentagon-driven thing. I have the impression that Bush is simply an impulsive, manipulable man. The last few weeks have shown that in domestic politics, have shown that he's the unstable guy here. I mean, we talk about Saddam Hussein being a madman and all that. Well, I have to wonder a little bit about our own fearless leader here. Not that he's crazy, certifiably, but that he's just not got a grip on things in general.
Well, I think this may be the case in that they're making their own decisions, but I still think we have to go back to some fundamentals, and that is, what are the rules? What does the Constitution say? Today, so many assume that they can do what they want depending on the circumstances. That's generally what is accepted. And my argument would be is, what does the Constitution say? They say the president's in complete charge of foreign policy because the Constitution says so. But the word foreign policy doesn't even exist in the Constitution, and most of the rules and regulations are designed for the Congress. And yet they say, well, the president's commander-in-chief. He can move the troops wherever he wants. But, you know, they didn't even believe in standing armies back there. And here we're moving hundreds of thousands of troops, if not 500,000 troops around the world, at the whims of a president without the consent of the people.
If there was one thing everyone agreed on when the Constitution was being written and debated, it was that powers needed to be divided. Everybody agreed. The Anti-Federalists agreed as well as the Federalists. And the one power in particular that they wanted splintered up was the power regarding war. The president was designated as the commander of the forces, but Congress was given the power to declare war and raise the money. In fact, for the Anti-Federalists, this was not enough. They thought that there was too much power in the Congress. They thought the Congress shouldn't be allowed to raise the money. If it could declare war, someone else should be raising the money, namely the states. They wanted it even more dispersed. Madison and those people knew very well, as we've heard this quote already, that it's the executive, an autocratic executive is what needs to be feared in this area of war. And war begets big spending, big taxes, regulation, all the things that they didn't want. They wanted a system that would not be easy to get into war.
But it's almost a cliche now that the president is in charge. And the other cliche that I disapprove of so strongly is that foreign policy has to be bipartisan, as if there shouldn't be a debate, as if both parties have to go along. Foreign policy and debate ends at our borders.
Well, one of the great non-interventionists, Felix Morley, put it that we always hear that politics stops at the water's edge. He says politics stops at the water's edge when policies stop at the water's edge, and right now policies don't stop at the water's edge.
That's right, so it should be debated.
Let's come back to that point, and let's get back to the water's edge in just a moment. We're going to take a brief break, and we'll return to more views and comments on the subject at issue in just a moment.
Throughout this series of programs, you will see ideas examined that affect every part of your life. We'll look at issues from a new angle, not from the left or the right, but from the perspective of individual liberty and responsibility. We believe our founding fathers were right. We are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is the right to life, liberty, and property. We do not accept your money transferred through state or federal government agencies. Instead, this series is funded by direct voluntary gifts from individuals. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Call us right now, 1-800-333-3545, extension 909. For a transcript of this program, specify the subject and send $5 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to P.O. Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. The National Endowment for Liberty, providing information on America's most precious resource, individual freedom.
Okay, we're back. During the break, Joe, you were starting to get into the idea of the general growth of government and what that means in this
Well,
issue.
I was taking off a little from what Ron and Sheldon have already said, Mike, that the Constitution authorizes Congress to exercise certain powers, and it lists those powers. The idea was that these were the only powers that Congress would have, i.e. that the federal government would really have, because the executive merely carries out the will of Congress. Now, the Congress is no longer inhibited. It's laughable to suggest that they confine themselves to those 17 enumerated powers. And by the same token, the executive has become interventionist in all sorts of ways, too. And it's as if all power has been given to the federal government, and now they're only haggling about which department gets to make these decisions on when to intervene domestically or abroad.
Let me follow up on that, because there's another concern that I have, not only about the bigness of our central government and this militant foreign policy that we maintain, but what about the shift now to an international approach? I mean, it's sort of a UN operation. George Bush likes to use this term, the New World Order. Should that be something that we should be concerned about, or do you think these are careless cliches?
Well, I think we're being handed a very dangerous false alternative. The alternative is either we do this under the auspices of the UN with everyone else, taking our marching orders from everybody else, or we pursue a unilateral interventionist policy throughout the world. I want no part of those two policies. I want the good old-fashioned American non-interventionist, some call isolationist, foreign policy, in the military sense purely.
Well, ironically, it was not until the middle of November that Congress began to assert its own prerogatives, and the only check on the presidential action in the Gulf came from other countries, not from the UN alone, but from the demands of the coalition. So the checks and balances that should have been applied by Congress then were applied only by these foreign entanglements.
Well, yes, and if we don't have those checks, and if the American people don't place their check on it, I think this is a very dangerous thing for the fact that our young men can lose their lives under the command of a UN army. Of course, this was started with Korea, but I think this is part of the problem from Korea on especially. We no longer declared war. I had a member of Congress once tell me, he said he never expected Congress ever to declare war again. And he thought this was a good policy because we lived in modern times and it was too cumbersome to go through this.
Well, we live in Orwellian times, I would say, not modern times. I mean,
That's
the
right.
idea where if we don't call it war, it's not war. It's a police action, incursion, or something else.
Yeah, but what is the great danger of all this? I mean, obviously there are great threats to us.
Well, as I said the other day to a little group in Rhode Island, the U.S. Constitution no longer poses a serious threat to our form of government.
Ron, our time's getting a little short. We're going to need to wind things up a bit. Let me ask each of you to comment on the short run for a moment. Joe Sobran, what's the next step? What's the first thing that ought to happen to get us on the road to a better foreign policy?
Well, I think that foreign policy is best which goes abroad least, and as far as military action goes. I think that there is now appearing a popular reaction, which Congress is expressing, against this war. At first, the public was pretty acquiescent. I think that's changing. And I think one very good thing about Mr. Bush's manifest incompetence is that it has helped to demolish the old mystique of the all-wise presidency.
Sheldon Richmond, what's your view? Is there one thing we could do right now?
The one thing we can do, I think, is to communicate to the leaders in this country that we have had it with this sort of foreign policy. We don't want to pay the taxes for it. We don't want our sons and fathers and sisters and mothers dying over this. We don't want our money flowing out into foreign aid. I mean, the whole thing is one whole program that needs to be dismantled. And we have to tell them that we're mad about it. We have to stop putting up with it.
Ron, your wrap up?
I think we should obey the law. We should obey the Constitution. We should not permit the president to pursue war without the consent of the people. I don't believe for a minute the American people would endorse war if they realized what's happening. They went along at the beginning of most of these adventures, but eventually when the body bags come back, the people wake up. And I think it is very important for the people to realize at the beginning, not to join the crowd. There was a book out once called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And when I think of that book, and when I think of how the American people join and jump on the bandwagon and rush out and are enthusiastic, but later on they change. Let's change our attitude first. Let's follow the rules.
That's where we'll have to leave it. I want to thank our panelists for being with us and you for watching. We'll be back next week for another vital topic at issue. The National Endowment for Liberty would like to acknowledge the inspirational contribution of John and Mary Pfeiffer and the sponsors of At Issue, whose generous support makes these programs possible.